beautiful people, and welcome back to my channel. So first off, I want to say happy Black History Month, and as you've probably seen from the title, the topic of this video is dealing with something that has become more apparent in our culture in America, which is the difference between African American and African immigrants or American Africans. So let's get right into it. So these past few weeks, as it's Black History Month, I have been thinking more and more about identity as an African American. In December, I even got my ancestry DNA results, and it turns out that I am about 88% African, which is good if you know the standards on that. But as I looked at my African culture, I started to wonder, and I'm like, we're called African American, but I really don't know or really have any sort of connection to the African heritage of mine. I don't know any of the customs, traditions, so why do they still call us African American? Well, typically the term came up as a thing to say, hey, you're American, but your ancestors are from Africa. So kind of to give us that sort of sense of pride, I guess, per se. But like in recent years, we still don't really have a connection to specifically African culture. But nowadays there is becoming more apparent a sort of Black culture that we have. So I'm going to bring up that in the video as well. So sometimes it can feel kind of wrong because we are so disconnected from that African culture. So I want to delve into some of these questions today and then try to compare that with maybe is African American a better term for those who specifically immigrate from Africa after like post-slavery. So we're going to get into this in this video, so I hope that you enjoy it. So, as I said before, African American refers to somebody whose ancestors were African and were enslaved and taken to America. So we are African American. Now, something that's more so American African is somebody who immigrated from Africa to America post slavery and like civil rights kind of stuff. I don't know necessarily civil rights, but that kind of thing. So there is such a difference between these two cultures. Though these names seem like almost exactly the same, African American, American African, there are some distinguishable differences. As I said earlier, people who are American African are much more connected to actual African culture. They know some traditions that they may have, some dances, some foods, while us who are called African Americans in this day and age, we have more of this American culture that we now define as Black culture. So though these are technically somewhat the same, there's a big difference in the culture, and I feel like sometimes we can just get wrapped up into the same identity as being African American and American African, when really there are so many big differences. So why were we even given this name in the first place? So the second thing we're going to talk about is America's obsession with race. So how did the term Black come to be, as I mentioned, with this Black culture thing that we got going on? So Black is from the Spanish and Portuguese language when they used to say Negro, which means Black in those languages, and a lot of other kind of European languages like that have different variations of this word as well. But nowadays it is seen, though it is specifically to the color Black, they are aware that some people may be offensive by that term, and so they are very much trying to dilute the word. They're not trying to use it at all in case to avoid any offense, if you know what I mean. So because of this colonial undertone, a lot of people did not like this term of like Negro or Negroes. Actually, Lyndon B. Johnson was the last president to use that term of Negroes, and later began using the term Blacks to describe those of African heritage. So like I said, we have this like variations nowadays of the word, and even like sometimes for Americans, African Americans specifically in the Black culture, they will still kind of use a different variation of this word, clearly, that I'm not going to say even though I'm Black. And now it's not seen as offensive in that term, but if it's used by someone other than that group, then it can have that colonial undertone that no one really wants to touch on. So that's a little bit of history about that. And like, if you're like me, a lot of this like cultural heritage stuff, it seems so confusing at times. Like, I'm Black, I'm African, but sometimes you just don't feel connected to those cultures that people lump you into, especially in America. So you would think maybe we should just not focus on race so much in America. Why do we have to have these different things to define people as? And that's something I've definitely been thinking about. Like, for instance, we have Asian American, Latin American, American, African American, but there's not really a European American. And you could say, oh, okay, well, that's Caucasian, but I don't know. And maybe it's just me being nitpicky, but I always wondered, I'm like, why don't we call people European American? Like, Caucasian is referring to that you are of European descent. I feel like sometimes it's often used as like the base. Anything else is like, okay, you're this and you're American. But it's like most people, us like Caucasian, African Americans, we're not really in touch with that culture that those people have before us. For example, they may be Italian, British, but they don't really have sense to any culture that's really in Britain, in my opinion. And us, we don't really have anything that's super distinct to Africa as well, in my opinion. So you're just like, why are we focusing on all these things? What do they really mean? And maybe we shouldn't focus on all these different boxes that we have to put ourselves in America. And yes, that is true in certain circumstances. But another thing that we really need to think about and understand with those names of African American, Asian American, Latin American, is some of those people really do have some ties to their culture and don't want to let that part of them go, or from their ancestors and stuff like that. They really want to hold on. And like, they really do know their culture. So I can understand that for like Asian Americans and Latin Americans, and why this would be such a prevalent thing that we use in America, though it is still so confusing sometimes. But even though we don't necessarily have, as African Americans, a specific thing to our African culture, we can actually have quite a lot of things to our Black culture in this new age. So this is going to lead us into the next topic, which is cultural identity. So though we're not really associated with African culture, we do nowadays have some Black culture. So this is, of course, in correlation with Black History Month, and there are so many things to be proud of, so many different musical genres that we can be connected to and trace ourselves and find ourselves in, that we can relate to in movies and stuff like that. But even though that's the great part of indulging ourselves in this Black culture, there's also times where it can feel kind of hurtful because of the stereotypes that can arise out of what people might present of our culture. But overall, we all need to be proud of our heritage, no matter how much we understand it, but appreciate those who came before us and those who will come after us, and embrace all of our heritage, whether it be good or bad. So ultimately, this is how I want to close out this video. Please tell me how you may culturally identify, if you're Black or African American or American African. I just kind of wanted to bring up this topic. I don't know all of the answers yet, but it's definitely things that have been on my mind, so I just wanted to share. So ultimately, I pray that y'all all have a great Black History Month and stay blessed.